Resourceful Designer, Episode 22, File Management for Graphic Designers.
Welcome to the Resourceful Designer podcast, offering solutions to streamline your graphic and web design business so you can get back to designing. And now, your host, his favorite font family, is Myriad Pro, Mark DeCote.
Welcome to another episode of Resourceful Designer. I'm so happy that you've been able to join me today as I discuss file management. I know, boring. And I can already hear some of you reaching for the stop button on your podcast player, but wait, I'm going to talk about a little bit more than just organizing a few files on your desktop. Trust me, in my 25 years of being a graphic designer, I've learned a few tricks or two along the way, and I'm hoping to pass some on to you, and maybe it's something you hadn't thought about. So stick with me today as I cover file management for your design files and resources, your client files, logos, stock images, fonts, training and educational pieces, your bookkeeping, and backups. But before I get to that, I'm happy to share another review I received on iTunes. And this one came in from Jay Magnicari from the USA. It says, this podcast is a must-have for designers, informative and inspiring. The resources and ideas in this podcast can be put to work immediately. Very enjoyable to listen to. Please keep them coming. Well, thank you for that. I tell you, I just love getting these reviews. It tells me that what I'm doing is making a difference, and it encourages me to keep on going. Now, if you would like to leave your very own review, no matter what country you're in, just visit resourcefuldesigner.com/iTunes, and it'll redirect you to the iTunes page where you can leave your review. Now, I'm going to be covering a few different links in this episode, and everything can be found on the show notes page at resourcefuldesigner.com/episode 22. Now, before I get into the meat of the episode, as always, I want to share a resource this week. And because of the topics I'm covering this week, I'm going to recycle a resource that I've already mentioned on a previous episode of the podcast, and that's Backblaze. I mean, file management is great. It can save you a lot of time, a lot of headaches, but it doesn't do you any good if you lose all your files. And you may be thinking, well, that's why I have backups. Maybe you have an Apple Time Machine, or maybe you have some external drive that you back everything up to, and that is great. Everybody should have something like that set up. But what happens if there was a fire and your house burnt down? Or some other natural disaster like a flood or a tornado, and everything got wiped out? Or what if your place got broken into and all your equipment was stolen? What would you do? Well, that's where Backblaze comes in. For only $50 per year, that's less than $5 a month, you can have the peace of mind of having all your files backed up off-site. Now, I know some of you are already using services like Dropbox to back stuff up, but Backblaze is so much easier. Backblaze is a set it up and forget it solution. It takes about 5 minutes to install, and then it just works in the background, backing up all your files to a secure off-site server so you never have to worry about losing anything again. And it's so easy to restore anything in case of a disaster. You can either set everything up and download it directly from their servers free of charge, or to make it even easier, you can have them ship you a physical hard drive with all your files on it for a quick and convenient way to restore once you're set up again. And another very handy thing about Backblaze is with their mobile app for both Android and iOS, you can access your files from anywhere in the world. And this isn't just the files that you save to your Dropbox. This is every single file that's on your computer. So no worrying on whether it was saved to Dropbox or not. Every file on your computer is accessible. And as I said, at less than $5 a month for this sort of peace of mind, I think it's something that everybody should look into. So if you think Backblaze is for you, and if you're interested in the security of having your files backed up off-site, visit resourcefuldesigner.com/backblaze and start a free trial to see if it's right for you. Now, I have to tell you, it has been a great week for me so far. I'm recording this Wednesday afternoon now, and I can tell you that in the last 2 days, I've gotten 5 new jobs come to me. 2 of them from old clients that have new projects for me to do, and 3 of them from brand new clients that want me to design logos. And I discussed my terms and everything with all 3 of them, and all of them were all for it. So now the contracts are signed, and I can't wait to get started. I don't know what it is about a logo, but they excite me more than any other type of design work. Already in bed last night, I had a hard time falling asleep because my mind was racing with all sorts of different ideas for all three of these completely different companies and organizations. And I just lay there awake with my eyes closed, designing all sorts of wonderful things in my head that I want to try out. But I don't need to tell you how that works. You're a designer. I'm sure you've spent many a night in bed going through different variations and different techniques and things you're going to try, because that's just the way we work. Unlike people working in retail or bankers or factory workers who just forget about work at the end of the day, us creative types have a little part of our brain that just never stops working. Now, I know of something that's probably never kept you up at night because you've been wondering about, and that's file management. I know it's not as glamorous as logo design or website creation, but file management is a very important part of running your graphic design business. Proper file management can save you a ton of time and headaches when it comes to finding stuff down the road. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to divide the conversation into different sections and talk about different types of file management depending on what files you're actually managing. So to start it off, I'm going to talk about design files and design resources as a whole. And when I'm talking about design files and design resources, I'm talking about stuff like software plugins or add-ons, or possibly backgrounds, brushes, and actions, all these different things that you would accumulate over the years. And the problem with this accumulation is that things do tend to get lost over time, especially if it's stuff that you don't use on a regular basis, or maybe never use, but keep for that day you might be needing it. I'm sure you have tons of resources on your computer, just like I do, that I've acquired over the years because one day I might need something like that. But the problem is sometimes when that day finally comes, you might not even remember that you had this thing from years ago. So the best way to keep track is to organize your files. So first, let me start off and say that on my computer, I'm on a Mac, and I can tell you that one of the most clicked on areas of my Mac is the favorites bar from any Finder window that's opened. And that's the bar on the left-hand side that displays special folders that you've placed there. Now, by default, you'll have your computer. If you've installed Dropbox will be there. You'll have your user account, your desktop, applications, and of course your documents, movies, pictures, and that sort of stuff. But you can also add folders to this favorites bar, and it becomes accessible from just about any application on your computer, which makes it so easy to find things. So if you're not already doing that, that would be the first thing I would suggest, is add your most used folders to your favorite bar. Now, I know there is an equivalent on Windows. If you're on Windows, there is an equivalent, but sorry, I don't have a copy of Windows for me to actually look it up. So maybe it's not called favorites on Windows, but whatever it is, there will be some sort of bar in the window with easy access to certain folders, and you should definitely put your most used folders in there. So in my case, under the normal ones, like desktop and my user folder and my applications, I have a folder called Jobs in Progress. Now, that name is a little misleading. I actually created this folder over 10 years ago when I first started thinking of getting in business, before I even registered my business. And I called it Jobs in Progress because that's exactly what it was. I had started working on a website for somebody, and I put it in this Jobs in Progress folder. And eventually this folder just grew to encompass all my client work. And I just never bothered changing it because there are some stuff in there that is not technically in progress. It's just my client job. So it could be my client's folder or whatever. I just myself never bothered changing the name. So I have that one, Jobs in Progress. I have another folder in there for Resourceful Designer and all things that have to do with that website and the blog and this podcast. I have another folder for Solo Talk Media, which is my other podcast network where I podcast about some TV shows. And I have a folder in there called Resources, and that's the one I want to talk about right now. In the Resources folder is where I save everything that I've gotten over the years from those bundles that you might buy or those freebies or whatever the case may be, that are the things you're going to hold on to that you might end up using someday in the future. Maybe you're familiar with Envato and their Code Canyon or Photo Dune, in which every month they give you a free resource. Now, I look at them every month, and if it's something that I think I might need in the future, I'll download it, and I have a folder called Envato. And in it, I divide it up into the same various subcategories that they have. So 3D Ocean, Active Den, Code Canyon, Graphic River, Photo Dune, Theme Forest, and Video Hive. And if it's something that I think I might use, and you got to be careful with a lot of these places where you get free stuff, because the tendency is, ooh, it's free, I'll download it. But some of these things take up a lot of memory, and in honesty, you probably never will use them. So you've got to be picky and look at it and say, is this something I'm really, really going to use? So I keep all of my stuff, all my free downloads from them in these folders. Now, it's not only the free downloads, anything I've actually purchased also goes into these folders. So if I look, for example, in the Code Canyon folder that's in my Envato folder, I will find several WordPress plugins that I have purchased for client sites over the years, and the zip files are stored in there. And that way, if I ever need them again, which sometimes happens for maybe another client site or something else down the road, I will have them right in there and easy to access. Now, I also have my resources folder that again is found in my favorites bar on the left-hand side of any Finder window. In that resources folder, I have stuff like backgrounds, and those would be just image files that you can use as backgrounds. And I have them divided up into various categories like metal, stone, leather, paper, because you never know when you're in the middle of a design and you say, you know what, a nice wooden background on this would look great. Well, instead of going searching all over the place, I already have on my very own computer a folder that just has wooden backgrounds in it. And I can easily go through there and see if there's something that I like. And I make a point that if I do use something from this folder for a client job, I will always open it in Photoshop, resize it or do whatever I need to, and then resave it to the client's folder. But I always leave the original file in this backgrounds folder so that I can use it at a future date. And the same thing, I have a folder in here for stock photos. And every stock photo that I have ever bought in the last 10 years is in this folder. Now, this folder is also divided up into different categories because I have one for people, one for landscapes, one for sports, miscellaneous, and various things. And I forgot to mention that they're subdivided beforehand into photos and vectors or illustrations, because all the vector stuff will go into a folder and then it's divided up into different whatever category I deemed appropriate. And once again, I never put the original in with the client work, because when you buy a stock photo, depending on your licensing right, a lot of times you can end up using this for more than one job. So there are stock photos that I've used for one client, and maybe a year or two down the road, there might be some reason for me to use it for a different client. For example, I had a photo of a boy that was struggling in class, and he was holding his head as the teacher was talking to him. And I used that years ago on a flyer I was doing for our local school board. But then just last year, I did a website for a hearing aid clinic, and they needed an image of a young boy that was having trouble hearing. And it just so happened that the look on this boy's face in this stock photo was perfect for the website. And it was so much easier for me to find than going to try to find the flyer I'd done many years ago for the school board. So I tend to keep all my stock images in this one area. And if, again, I resize them, I manipulate them, I do any color correction or anything, then I will save the corrected image to the client folder. But the original untouched image, whether it's a stock photo, whether it's a vector image downloaded from some stock image site or whatever, everything is found in this one folder. And it makes it so much easier to find stuff. If I want to find a photo of a woman shopping, I could just quickly go through my folder and see if I have anything on hand before having to go purchase a stock photo somewhere else. Now again, another folder in this resources folder is Photoshop Actions. And I've got tons of actions that I've acquired over the years. Some of them I've purchased, and some of them have come as part of bundles. I love the Design Cuts bundles. If you're not familiar with them, you can visit designcuts.com. Well, they have bundles that they put out that usually, like for $29, you get a ton of vector images, fonts, backgrounds, Photoshop actions, all sorts of stuff. And you get the entire bundle. Sometimes it might just be a couple of things, like maybe it's a font or it's a special vector or a background that I want, but you get everything. So some of these Photoshop actions, I look at them, and again, you don't have to download everything from their site, but some of them I say, well, this could be really useful, but I have no use for it right now. So I download it and I put it in this folder, Photoshop Actions, and I label it what it is. Because I don't want to install all these actions as I get them in Photoshop, because then your Photoshop Actions folder becomes so crammed with things that it's hard to find the action you want to use. So I leave them in this folder until it's time to use them. The same goes with Photoshop Styles. I have so many brush styles and other styles to use that I don't want them all installed in Photoshop at the same time. So I will keep copies of them in this Photoshop Styles folder. Mockups is another one. You know those Photoshop files where if you design a business card, you can call up this mockup and you drop your business card design on it and it'll create an image to make it look like there's a pile of printed business cards on somebody's desk with the desk blotter and a pen next to it. Well, I've got a whole folder full of these things that I've acquired over the years. Some of them I've paid for, some of them have come as part of bundles. And I keep them all in one area so that if I ever need a mock-up of a billboard or a mock-up of a business card or a flyer or a car wrap or whatever the case may be, I can just go directly to my mock-ups folder, which is subdivided into the different categories, and I find whatever I want, and there we go. If it's not there, if I can't find it in that folder, I know I don't have to look anywhere else on my computer because I don't have it. If I did have it, it would be in this folder. So it saves me time trying to think, do I have one like that? Because maybe I got something from some bundle. And the problem is when you get these bundles, there's so many things in it. You remember them on the spot, but 6 months down the road, you don't remember everything that came with that bundle, especially if you purchase the bundle for maybe a specific font or a specific vector graphic. Well, you won't remember that when you purchased that bundle, it also came with a mock-up of a coffee mug. But if I go look in my mockups folder, I will see a folder in there called mugs. And in it, I have 3 different mockups of coffee mugs that I can use if I want to. So anyways, all of that to say that in this resources folder are all the things that would help me in my designing that I might not necessarily use on a regular basis or that I don't necessarily want installed in the various software just because it'll take up too much room in the menus and in the palettes. And if it's not something you use on a regular basis, or if you've never used it, but you think you might have to someday, then this is where I store it. So again, that's resources, and that's where I keep all my plugins, my add-ons, backgrounds, vector images, stock photos, any sort of brushes for Illustrator or Photoshop, any actions. I also keep stuff like WordPress plugins and WordPress themes. Anything that I could use that would be considered a resource is in this folder. Now, client files. Now, client files is the one where you talk to 10 different designers and they will have 10 different ways of managing their client files. Now, I'm going to go over what I do, but I don't say it's the best way. Maybe you have a much better way of organizing your files than I do. I'm just going to explain to you how I do it that has worked for me. And this is a system that I've altered, I've switched, I've changed, and I've built it up over the years to a way that I can easily find the files I need really quickly. So as I mentioned, in my favorites bar on the left-hand side of any Finder window, I have a jobs in progress file, which actually contains every single client I've ever had. Whether they're in progress or not, they're all in there. And of course, they're alphabetical. Now, in it, I do have a folder that I called old clients. And in that folder are any client that I know will never come back to me. Like they were only a one-time job for a special event, or the client went out of business, or the company was bought out by another company, so I know that none of that stuff will ever be used again. All of those files are put into a folder called Old Clients. Now you might say, Mark, what's the point of keeping them? You just said the companies don't exist anymore. They're no longer around. Why do you need those files? Well, I used to think that way too, and I would just get rid of stuff. But then every once in a while, somebody will come back and say, hey, you remember that company or whatever? I need something, or I need that. Or maybe somebody that used to work there will come back and say, I would love to take some of the information that was on that. Do you still have a copy of those files? Now, I do have another hard drive, an external drive, that I keep old client files on, stuff that I haven't accessed in 5-6 years, or again, the client doesn't exist anymore. But I do keep more recent ones on my computer because, as I said, you never know when you'll have to go back to them. Now, I also, in my Jobs in Progress folder, have another folder called Inactive Clients. And inactive is any client that I haven't done any work for in the last 2 years. Now, you can adjust this to any time you want, but I say 2 years. And just looking at some of the modified dates in some of my other client stuff, I can see that there are a few that I might have to move into this folder soon. But those are all clients that are still around. They still exist. Maybe for one reason or the other, I'm not working for them anymore. Maybe they just don't need any design work. Or maybe they've moved on to another designer. Well, I don't get rid of any of those files. They're in the inactive client list. And that leaves the rest of my Jobs in Progress folder with what I call current clients. Any client that I've done work for in the last 2 years. And of course, they're all listed alphabetical, which makes it really easy. When a client calls up, I can open up this folder, find them, and open up their folder, which contains absolutely everything about that client. Now, the way I divide my client files, when I open up a folder for a specific client, in it, you will find folders for every project that I've worked on for that client. Now, a project may be their stationery, in which case I'll call it stationery, and then the stationery will be subdivided down into business cards, letterheads, envelopes, and so forth. But other project stuff might be a newsletter I did for them, maybe a flyer, maybe a vehicle wrap, their website, whatever the case may be. Every project has its own folder. And then when you open that folder, depending on the client, you will either find the actual work, or in some cases, I will have a year folder. So say there's a client that I do a lot of regular work for. When I open up the project folder, it'll be divided up then with a bunch of folders listed by year. So 2016, 15, 14, 13, 12, and so forth. And then those are divided, if need be, down to the month. Now, I say this, I don't have a lot of clients to do this. I do have one client that I do a weekly ad for. Every Monday, I do an ad for this client that goes into our local paper. And this is how their folder is subdivided. So I have my client name. In it, I have a project folder called weekly ad. When I open that folder, then it goes up to year. So I've started the 2016. When I open 2016, I'll have January. And then when I open up January, it would be divided down into January 4th, 11th, 18th, and 25th, which are the 4 Mondays that are in January, because those were the ads I had to do. And then I have February, and I do the same thing. And in each of the actual dates, I will have the files and everything required in order to create that specific ad. Now, the reason I do this is because sometimes a client will repeat an ad. As an example, this coming weekend is Valentine's Day. Well, instead of creating a brand new ad for Valentine's Day, my client asked me if we can use an ad from 2 years ago and just change some of the wording on it because they really liked the look of the ad and the images I had used. So it made it really easy for me to just go into the 2014 February and find the ad that came out before Valentine's Day, open it up and make some changes to it. It was very easy to find because of the way I manage the files. But that's just one case. In some cases, I'll just do it by year. Like there's a local festival I do that happens once per year. Well, their folder will be divided by year and I won't subdivide it down into months because every year we redo everything and create new artwork and such. But I hold on to the older files because sometimes some of that stuff repeats. So that's the way I divide up the files per project. So it's always the client, then the project that I'm working on, and then the year, and if need be, month and day. But once you get down to the actual folder that your physical files and everything, or not physical, I know we're on a computer, but the actual files you're working on, every client file that I have is divided the same way. I have a folder called working, which is my working files, which would be my Illustrator AI files, my Photoshop PSD files, and any other sources that I need, the files that I'm actually physically using as work. They're not the final files or anything like that. They're just the files that I'm actually working on are under this folder called working. Then next to that folder, I have one called images, and that's where I would put the final images. So in the working file, I might have the Photoshop file that with all the layers and everything I'm doing. But when I'm finished that, I'll flatten it and maybe save it as a TIFF or as a JPEG or whatever it needs to be. And I will save that file into the images file. Now, in with the client file, I also have a folder that's called supplied. And supplied is anything that the client gave you. And that folder could be subdivided. It could be images. It could be text. But these are all things that the client gave you. If they gave you the text to go on their website or their brochure or whatever the case may be, it would be in here. If they gave photos, if they gave logos, anything the client gives me goes into the supplied file so that I know this came from the client. If I'm going to use any of it and I'm like, say, one of the photos they gave me, I will open that photo in Photoshop, do whatever I have to do with it, and then resave it to the images folder. But the original one that the client supplied me stays in the supplied folder. And then next to these folders, the working, the supplied, the images, will be my actual job. If I'm working on a website, it'll be the website files. If I'm working on a brochure or a pamphlet, it'll be my page layout files, whether I'm working in Quark Express or in InDesign. And just to let you know, I'm more of a Quark Express person. I do have InDesign. I've used it, but I prefer working in Quark Express. I've been using it since version 2.5, and I've never stopped using it even when InDesign came out. I know a lot of people say InDesign is a much better software, and I have worked with InDesign over the years when I've had to, but I know Quark Express like the back of my hand, so I'm extremely comfortable working in it, and I just keep doing so. So my Quark or InDesign files will be in that main folder along with the supplied working and images folder. And then of course at the end, if need be, I will have another folder that it would be files for printer or files for client or whatever. And that's where I would save, say, the final PDFs that are being sent off to get printed. They will be in that folder. Or the final JPEGs that have to go to a website for maybe a banner ad or if it's an animated GIF or whatever the case may be. The final files will always be in their own folder. And that makes it really easy for down the road if somebody says, oh, can you give me this file? I'll know exactly which one is the final file to give them. So that's what I found to be the easiest way for me to work. So whenever I open up a client file, I'll automatically see all the projects I'm working on. Like if I'm clicking around on my computer right now, I just open up a client file here and immediately in it, I see print ad, poster, brochure, rack card, website, tote bag artwork, billboard, and a few other things. So all those different projects I've worked on for this one client. And if I was to open those folders, then they would either be subdivided down by year, month, day, if need be, or you would see a folder that would have my actual page layout file and then have folders for supplied, working, images, and final files in it. And that's the way every one of my client files is. And I've found over the years that this is the best method that works for me. Now, one thing I just want to touch on is images. In some cases where the same image will be used on multiple projects for a client, I do have an images folder right in the client folder that makes it easy access from any project. So in some cases, a client might have maybe a certain photo that they use on everything, or maybe there's a certain icon or a certain graphic or something that they use on absolutely everything. Well, that would be found in the images folder directly under the client folder. Now, you may have noticed that I did not say logo. And whenever I say images that may be used on a bunch of different client projects, you would think that logos would fall under that images folder. But I learned years ago not to do this. And I'll tell you why. And you might disagree with me on this one, but I found a method that has saved me so much time over the years. Remember when I started off, I said I have a folder called resources? In the resources folder, I have one called logos. And when I open the logos folder, it is subdivided by folders for every single logo I have on my computer. And when I say every single logo, I'm talking about whether they're my clients or other logos that I happen to have. And I've learned over the years that it's easiest to store all the logos in one place because it makes it so much easier to find things whenever I need to. Now, some people might say, well, that's a little counterproductive. If you have a certain client you do work for, why wouldn't their logo be in the client folder? Well, let me tell you why I do it this way. Have you ever had a project to do for a client? Maybe it's a theater or a local production company, or maybe it's a special event, or maybe a festival, and you have had to design a poster for them, and at the bottom of the poster, they say, here's a list of our sponsors we'd like you to add. And then they'll give you 10, 15, 20 logos that they want included at the bottom of the poster. Now, what used to happen to me is I would gather up all these different logos and I would create a folder under my client file that would be sponsor logos. And I would throw all the logos in there. And I would design the poster and my client would be happy and the poster would get printed and then I would move on to the next job. Then maybe 6 months, 9 months, a year later, I would get another poster from a different client. And there'd be a similar thing. They would ask me for a bunch of logos to put at the bottom of their poster. And some of them, sure enough, would be the same logos, but I might not remember that that logo was on the other poster, especially if it's not one of my clients or somebody I don't know very well. And next thing you know, I would have a folder under that client that would say sponsor logos. And some of them would be duplicate and there would be some new ones. And then the pattern would repeat. Another few months down the road, I might have to do another one and so forth and so forth. But what I found was happening is that sometimes I would spend time trying to track down a logo or talking to a client saying, I need a better copy of the logo. No, I can't take the logo off the website. I need a vector version of such and such a logo, only to find out later that I already had that logo because I had put it on a poster 2 years ago that I just didn't remember. Or sometimes a client would supply me with a logo and I didn't know that I actually had a better quality version from a previous project. So what I decided to do at some point is in my resources folder, I created a folder called logos. And then I started creating a folder for every company that I had a logo for. And now, whenever I get a project like this, it is so easy for me to look to see if I already have the logo, if I need to bother working or finding a better copy of whatever. Now I can just look in my logos folder and see if it's there. And if I open up that folder now, I currently have 661 different companies that I have logos for. So when a client comes to me and say, we're putting on a new production at the local theater company and we need these 20 sponsor logos. And you know the way clients are, sometimes they're going to say, well, we don't have them all yet. I can easily look at their list and go through and say, well, I already have this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. In some cases, I have them all. In some cases, I'll come back to them and say, I only need you to track down these 3 logos because I have all the other logos. And it was so easy, I was able to find them in a couple of minutes. And just to make it easier, I put my client logos in there as well. Now, let me tell you a little story here. This has also helped me a lot. If you are like me and you have befriended other designers in your area, there are times where you're going to call upon them or they're going to call upon you for something. And sometimes sharing logos and that is the norm. I can tell you that when a client comes to me and they say, I've got a whole bunch of sponsors, sometimes I would much rather try to find the logo myself because I know I'm going to get what I want instead of telling the client to try to get me the logos, because chances are they're just going to go grab a logo off a website or whatever the case is going to be. And I'm going to have a heck of a time trying to work with it, if I even try to work with it. So sometimes what I'll do is if I know that a certain company uses such and such a designer, I'll just call that designer up and say, hey, I know you do the work for this company. Can you send me their logo? I'm putting up, they're a sponsor of such and such an event and I need to put their logo on it. And that designer will send me the logo. I mean, that's the way we work. Well, let me tell you this story. There was once this other designer in town that was designing a poster for some event. And they called me up and they had, I forget how many, but it was roughly about 20 different logos that they needed. Now, they were calling me up because they knew that 2 of the logos were from companies that were clients of mine. So they were calling to ask about those 2 specific logos. Well, as soon as I got on the phone with the designer and he told me what he was looking for, I immediately opened up my email program and I started an email to the designer and I typed in the subject line, requested logos. Then I opened up a Finder window, moved over to my resources folder, found my logos folder, and I immediately went down to my 2 clients because there were their logos, opened up those folders, grabbed the logos they wanted, and dragged them over to the email. Then I asked the designer, are there any other logos he was looking for? And he started going down a list of, do you have this one? Do you have this one? Do you have that one? And as he was talking, I would say, yes, I have that one. Yes, I have this one. No, I don't have that one. And we went down his whole list. Well, at the end, it ended up that I had maybe 80% of the logos he was looking for. I had copies of them. And he was thrilled to find out. So at the end of the conversation, he asked me, how soon do you think you can get me those logos? And my response to him was, check your inbox. I already sent them to you. Well, let me tell you, the amazement I heard on the other end of the phone line when his email chimed and he looked and there were all the logos that we just finished talking about. He asked me, he says, how did you do that? And I just told him, I'm very well organized. So there was something I was able to help a designer out. It didn't take me any extra time than the few minutes I spent on the phone with him going over these things because of my organization, my file management when it came to logos. Everything was in one folder. I just looked through. I typed in every time he'd say a company name. I'd start typing the name. That folder would highlight. I had him in list view, so I just clicked the little triangle next to it to open up the list view, grabbed the logo he wanted and dragged it over to the email, and then moved on to the next one. So I don't know if this is something you're interested in, but I've found over the years that by isolating and putting all my logos in one spot has saved me a ton of time and headaches trying to find stuff. Now, I want to give you a little secret here, and this might not be considered file management, more file acquisition, but I want to give you 2 of my tricks for getting logos when you need good quality logos for certain projects. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you ask your clients for good logos, half the time you're going to get crap from them. I mean, I've had clients say, yeah, I've got a great copy of the logo. Here's their flyer. You can scan it in. Or, yeah, I've got a great copy of the logo. I grabbed it off their website. So let me tell you 2 tricks that I use in order to first save me time and headaches and for me to stop having to deal with the client in order to get the proper logos. Trick number 1, contact the head office. If you're looking for a logo that has to do with any sort of chain or franchise or anything like that, don't deal with the local office. Half the time they don't know what they're doing, or they don't know who has the proper version of the logo, especially if you're looking for a vector file. The easiest thing to do is phone the head office and ask to speak to somebody in marketing, and then tell them that you're a graphic designer, you're working for such and such a company, you need a copy of the logo, and you thought it would be easier to get it from them. And they would be happy to help you. Especially, I found, if you ask them if they have a style guide to go along with their logo, just the fact that there's a designer asking for a style guide, wow, they'll bend over backwards to help you. I remember doing work for a local power sport company who sold motorcycles and ATVs and skidoos and all that. And he was an Articat dealer, and he wanted to do something, and the copy of the Articat logo that he gave me was not very good. So instead of trying to deal with him, because I know that he has some sort of client portal that he can go through and get logos and that, but he didn't know what he was doing. So I just contacted Articat directly. I went to their head office, I asked for their marketing department, and the lady over there, I told her what I needed, and within a couple of minutes, she had sent me a zip file containing all different variations of the logo for me to use, as well as access information to their media database with high-res photos of all their products in case I wanted to use them on any of their brochures or whatever I was doing for my client. It took me about a 2-minute phone call to get all that stuff that could have taken me 15, 20 minutes trying to deal with the client to get the same thing. So whenever you need a logo or any sort of marketing material and you're dealing with a franchise or some sort of chain, it's best to go directly to the head office and get it from them. Now, the other little trick that I'll tell you, if you want to get a good copy of a logo, especially if you're looking for a vector version of the logo, sometimes what I'll do is I'll look up the website in Google, and you do a search where you type in the search bar, site, and then the domain you want, followed by a space, and then you type file type, as all one word, file type, PDF. And what that does is Google will search for all the PDF files that are on the domain that you're asking about. And then what I do is it looks like a normal Google search, but everything there is a PDF. So I will click and open a whole bunch of them in new tabs. And then I will go through the tab by tab until I see one that looks like it has a good logo. And sometimes you got to zoom in to see the quality of the logo. And when I see one that I says that looks like it's good enough quality to be vector, I'll download that PDF, and then I'll open that PDF in Adobe Illustrator. And sure enough, if it's a vector logo, I can isolate that logo, pull it out, put it on its own file. Now I have a crisp, clean copy of that logo, and it only took me a few minutes because I did that search. So again, you just do a search in the Google search bar for site, and then the website you're looking in, and then you leave a space and you do file type, PDF. And that has saved me tons of time over the years in searching for logos and such. Now, the next item I had on my list here was stock images, but I kind of covered that in the resources section. So I'll just quickly, in stock images, as I said, it's in my resources file. I have one called stock images, and in it, it's divided up into photos and vectors and illustrations, because sometimes you'll have illustrations that are not vector files. So I have photos, illustrations, and vectors. And then inside each of those, I will subdivide it. So say in photos, I will have one that's people. I'll have another one that's landscapes. I'll have another one that's vehicles, and so forth. And I'll divide it up that way so that down the road, if I ever need to find a specific stock photo for something, I can go and quickly look through there to see what I have. And sometimes if a photo will fall into two categories, I'll create an alias of it and put the alias into the other category. An example is I have a photo that I used for a client that it was a picture of a couple in a convertible. And I have that photo in a folder under people, couples, and then there's that photo because it's couples. But I also have an alias of that photo under vehicles as well. So if I'm looking at vehicles, I'll come across that photo of a convertible with a couple in it. Because trust me, over the years, you will amass a huge library of stock photos. And if you don't find some way to organize it, you're going to have a heck of a time finding stuff later on. Now, speaking of stock photos, I just want to let you know if you visit my resources page on the website, resourcefuldesigner.com/resources, I have 3 stock photo sites listed there. I have graphic stock, iStock, and deposit photos. And with graphic stock, if you click through, you'll get a coupon code for 83% off a yearly subscription. And both iStock and deposit photos, there's a coupon code there that's good till the end of March. And if another coupon code comes out afterwards, I'll just update that site. Right now, I think it's 20% off for new clients of iStock and deposit photos. And I believe iStock is also 10% off if you're an existing client that's buying more credit or extending your subscription. So you can get those coupon codes by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/resources. And those 3 stock images sites are listed there along with all my other resources. So now moving on to fonts. Now fonts is another one that, wow, can you amass a lot of fonts over the years? And it is really difficult to keep track of everything. Now, I'll tell you that on my computer, at the root level of my hard drive, so that they're accessible to any user that's on my computer, I have a folder called My Fonts. Now, this is not the same as fonts that's already there. This is My Fonts. And when you open up My Fonts, I have 24 folders listed A, B, C through the rest of the alphabet. And within each one are the fonts that fall under those names. Now, that's just the way I have them stored on my hard drive, so that any font that starts with the letter A would be in the A folder, the B folder, the C folder, and so forth. But what I use for font management is software called Suitcase Fusion by Extensys. And if you want to know more, visit resourcefuldesigner.com/font management. Now, I've been using Suitcase Fusion since I can't remember when. Well, when I started using them, it was just Suitcase. And then at some point, after I forget what version, then it became Suitcase Fusion. And then they've worked Suitcase Fusion 2, 3, 4. And now I believe number 7 is under works. I don't think it's been released. I think it's in beta, but I'm on Suitcase Fusion 6. And this is what I use to manage my fonts. Now, I know there are a lot of different softwares out there for managing fonts, but I've been using Suitcase Fusion for so many years that I don't think I could switch to anything else. And in it, I have my font library, which is divided very much the way I mentioned my folder is, which is A, B, C, D, E, and so forth. And in it, all the fonts starting with the letter A are under the A folder and B, the B folder, and so forth. But I also have other folders for specific type of fonts. Like I have a folder that's specifically Celtic fonts. I have a folder for fancy scripts. I have a folder for hand-drawn fonts. I have a folder that's just called different, which is fonts that are made up of like weird things, like maybe, little illustrations of people contorting themselves in different ways to make up the different letters, or different letters of the alphabet made up out of animals and that sort of thing. Well, those are under a folder called different fonts. And then with the Suitcase, every font you have, you can label it and assign it attributes as you see fit. So if you have a font and it's labeled as an ultra bold or an extended font or so forth, then you can search through your library for specific things. Like you can search for extended fonts and it'll list all the extended fonts you have, or even ultra black fonts. You can search for all serifs or all sans serifs. You can search rounded fonts and so forth. There's a lot to do at first, but once you get into the habit that every time you add a font to Suitcase, you immediately go in and apply the styles that you're interested in applying to it, then it makes it so easy later when you're working on a project and you're looking for a specific type of font. Like maybe you're doing something for some hoedown and you're looking for Western fonts. Well, you type in the keyword Western and every font that you've labeled with the keyword Western will show up. And it makes it so much easier than looking through hundreds or even thousands of fonts to try to find the right one. And the great thing about something like Suitcase Fusion is that most of your fonts are not actually activated. You just activate them on an as-needed basis. So you don't have thousands of fonts clogging up your system. You just turn the fonts on. Once you find one you like, you turn it on. There are certain fonts that are on permanently, but the rest of them, I just turn them on as I need it. And the great thing is that there's extensions for Quark Express, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, all the major programs. They have extensions that you can add on so that if there's a certain font that's being used in a file, as soon as you open that file, say in InDesign, then any fonts associated with it will automatically open in Suitcase. And you can have it set that when you quit InDesign, it'll automatically close those fonts, or you can have it so that those fonts remain open. So in case you want to use them in Illustrator or Photoshop or whatever the case may be. But I think that next to your client files and your resource files, your font management is one of the most important things for you to do as a graphic designer and will save you the most time in your day-to-day work, especially when you're looking for that special font for a certain job. It makes it so much easier when you say, I definitely want a serif font, so you eliminate all the sans serif fonts of your search, all the script fonts, all the hand-drawn fonts, and you only search the fonts that might actually fit the description you're looking for. So that's font management. And again, if you're interested in Suitcase Fusion, that's resourcefuldesigner.com/font management. And I'm not an affiliate with them. I don't get any money if you do buy through that. I just believe in this company so much that I'm passing it on to you. Now, this podcast is starting to get a little bit longer than I intended, so I'm going to go through the rest of this pretty quick. The next thing I want to talk about is training and education. And these are all the resources that you get, maybe some ebooks, maybe some videos that you might accumulate over time to help you learn different things. And sometimes they're great for teaching, but if you don't need to know it right now, sometimes it's not the best time to learn it. Episode 8 of Resourceful Designer was all about just-in-time learning, where I talked about not bothering to learn something until you actually needed to know it, because chances are, if you learn something and you're not using it, you will end up forgetting it. So what I do is I keep a folder called training/education, and in it, I'll keep anything I might need in order to learn something at a future date. And I divide it up by subject within that folder. So I will have websites, Photoshop, design, and so forth. And say websites, you open up websites, and I will have folders for CSS, PHP, HTML, and so forth. And within them, I will have little training videos. Like maybe there's a certain thing I thought was really cool with CSS that you could do, but I didn't really need it right now. I would put the training or the link or whatever in there. Or if there's any ebooks, or even if there's a website, if you go into your web browser and you click on where the URL is, you can usually drag that to your desktop or to whatever folder, and it'll create a link directly to that website. So sometimes I might find a YouTube video or a training website, tutorial website, and it has something really interesting, but I don't really need to know it right now. I'll just grab that and drag it over to my training folder, place it in the right spot, and then it's there if I ever need to learn it in the future. Just recently, I had to do some artwork for a client and make something look like it was a badge. You know, one of those kind of tin round badges with a pin on the back that you would stick onto your shirt or your jacket. Well, they wanted their artwork to look like that, and with all the shading and the gloss and everything. And I remembered a tutorial I had, and sure enough, I went through and it was a Photoshop tutorial that I found, and it was a link to a web page. And when I clicked on it, the web page opened up and it had step-by-step instructions on exactly how to do what I wanted. So instead of spending time searching the internet, finding this thing to learn or trying it on my own, because I knew lots of people had already done this sort of thing, at one point I'd come across this and I said, I might need to know how to do this one day. So I copied the URL and put it into my Photoshop tutorials. And whenever I needed it, there it was. I was able to quickly find that website, follow the steps, and create the badge I needed in no time. So it's always a great idea to organize your training and education material for easy access. Even if it's something you've learned in the past, keep track of it so that next time when you actually do need it, and you might not remember all the fine details, you can easily go back and find it there. Now, the next topic I wanted to talk about is bookkeeping. And this one's going to be short. The only thing I want to say about bookkeeping is when you're sending your invoices out to your clients, I started a habit when I first got into business. Actually, it was my second year, maybe third year in business, is every January, I would reset my invoices and start them off with the year. So in January of this year, I use a program called Billings Pro. And you can do this, I presume, in whatever program you're using, if you're using FreshBooks or QuickBooks or whatever. But I use a program called Billings Pro by Market Circle. And if you want to know more, resourcefuldesigner.com/billings. And in it, you can change the numbering scheme. So at the beginning of January, I changed my numbering scheme so that every invoice starts off with 16 dash, and then I start off at 0001. And throughout the year, I'll just keep invoicing clients and they'll all start with 16 dash until it gets up to whatever number. And then next year, I'll change it to 17 dash. Now, I've done this every year going back. I think I started in 2008, where every invoice started off with 08. And the reason I do this is because for some clients, if I do enough work for them, sometimes they'll come back and they'll say, that job we did a few years ago, I'd like to do that again, or I'd like to use some of that information. Well, sometimes the client will come back to me and say, this job that I did on invoice number, and they'll give me the invoice number, and they'll say, we did this flyer. Well, I'd like some of this information for the flyer, or can we redo that flyer with just some minor updates to it? Well, the fact that they can now tell me it was invoice number 12- whatever, I immediately know that when I go look for that flyer for the client, that I'm not going to look in their 2013, 2014 folder. I immediately go to the 2012 folder because that's the invoice they gave me was 2012. And then I find the flyer and that's the one. So that's the reason I do it. I know this one isn't that important. It also helps me that at the end of the year, I can look back because all my invoices are saved in one folder. I have Billings Pro set up to save a copy of every single invoice I send out in a special Billings folder on the computer. And I can easily go through that folder and see all the invoice that I sent out in 2008, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And it just gives me an idea of how many jobs, how many projects I worked on, or how many clients I sent invoices for. So that's bookkeeping. Now, the last thing I want to talk about file management has to do with, well, my resource of the week that I mentioned at the beginning, which was Backblaze, and that's backing up your files. You can have the most amazing file management system there is, but it doesn't do you any good if you somehow lose your computer, whether it gets wiped out through a hard drive crash or some natural disaster, or gets fried somehow through power surge, whatever the case may be. No matter how good your file management system is, it's useless. You can't get it back after some sort of disaster. So everybody should be backing up your files. You should have some sort of backup in-house, whether it's something like Apple's Time Machine, or you just have some other external drive that you clone your computer to or you back up to. Everybody should have something like that, but you should also have some sort of external backup. And for your local computer, as I mentioned as my resource, I highly recommend Backblaze, resourcefuldesigner.com/Backblaze. It is so easy. You just set it up and then you never have to worry about it again. And that's the thing. You hope that you never have to touch it again. And that is well worth $50 a year, in my opinion. If something ever happens to my computer here, if this hard drive was to crash tomorrow, or if somebody broke in and stole all my equipment here, I know that every single file I have is backed up. Because Backblaze is automatic backup. I have it set up so that it backs up almost on an hourly basis, and it works in the background, so I never have to worry about it. Now, the other thing backup I want to talk about is your website. Especially if you're a web designer and you design websites for clients. A lot of hosting providers say they back up websites, but you have to be really careful because most of them, yes, they will back up the site, but they don't back it up on a regular basis. The backup might be 30, 60, sometimes even 90 days old. So according to their terms and conditions, yes, they have a backup of the site, but it doesn't mean the site's up to date or the backup is up to date. You truly want to back up your website, especially for your site or your client sites that might change on a regular basis. I highly recommend looking into Backup Buddy by iThemes. And you can look in more by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/Backup Buddy. Now that's what I use on all my sites and all my client sites. And it's so easy, especially now they just released their new Backup Buddy 7 with the new feature of live backups, which means the site is constantly being monitored and gets backed up anytime anything new happens on the site. So if you have a client or if you are constantly updating, adding content, you don't have to worry about losing anything ever again because the site is backed up as soon as something new is added to it. And the best thing about it is the load is not placed on your server. It's the server at the other end where the backup is being stored that handles all the load. So I've been using Backup Buddy for website backup for some time now, but I have to tell you, since version 7 came out and it's only been a couple of days now, the improvements that they've introduced has made it so much easier to back up a website and not have to worry about it. So whatever you choose to do, I suggest you find some sort of backup strategy with on-site backups, with hard drives and such. Off-site backups with something like Backblaze, resourcefuldesigner.com/Backblaze. I know there are other options out there, but I don't know them, so I won't talk about them. I know Backblaze very well, and that's why I recommend it. And for your website backups, I can't say enough good things about Backup Buddy, resourcefuldesigner.com/Backup Buddy. So that's my talk about file management. I know it's a boring topic, but we all have to deal with it. And I hope that maybe you learned something or picked up a little trick along the way that might help you in the long run. And if not, I thank you for putting up with me for this time. Now, in next week's episode of Resourceful Designer, I'm going to be covering the dangers of working from home. Nope, it's not all fun and games. So I hope you check that one out. But before I go, I'm happy to announce that I do have another question of the week this week. And if you have any questions for me, please visit resourcefuldesigner.com/feedback and submit it. And if it's a good question, I'll include it on the podcast. So this week's question comes from Terry. And Terry says, "Hi, Mark. I just started listening to your podcast in the past month and I'm really enjoying it. Thanks for all the fantastic advice." Oh, thanks, Terry. It says, "I've been working in the industry for about 7 years now here in Atlanta, Georgia. After the birth of my daughter a year and a half ago, I started working from home part-time, which I love, and it has been keeping me quite busy. I was wondering if you had any advice on passing off work to other designers. Is there a good network you use, or how do you build that network? I also feel that part of my value as a designer is that I know the clients and what they're looking for. Thus, it's difficult to explain that to another designer, especially with a super fast turnaround." Well, thanks for the question, Terry. And this is an interesting one. Now, you have to think, why would you want to be passing work off to other designers? I mean, personally, the only time I've ever done this, the only time I've ever passed work off to another designer is either when I'm approached by a client and they really give me a bad vibe and I really don't want to work with them, which I kind of touched on last week's podcast about ending client relationships. So if they give me a bad vibe, maybe I'll say no and recommend somebody else, or just tell them maybe they should find another designer. Or in some cases, when I'm really too busy and they need it in a big rush, then I might suggest another designer. But in my opinion, and I think I mentioned this in last week's episode, in my opinion, most clients don't need the stuff as fast as they actually say they do. And if you tell them that you're too busy, that you wouldn't be able to get to their stuff for maybe a couple of weeks, a lot of times that quick turnaround or that deadline they had disappears and they say, well, you know what? I'll stick around and we'll wait. That's okay. That's acceptable. And they'll wait for you to be able to work on it. At least that's in my opinion. I found that there's been so many times where a client has says, well, I really need something for Friday. And I'll tell them, well, I'm sorry. I wouldn't even be able to start it until next Wednesday. And all of a sudden they come back and say, well, that'd be acceptable. Well, what happened to Friday that you just said you absolutely needed it for Friday? The thing is sometimes they really want to work with you. And especially if you're telling them no, because you're so busy, it almost gives them the impression you're so busy because you're so good. And if you're that good, I really want to work with you. Now, in the few cases where a client really does need something done and I can't do it, I never just recommend one designer. I know a bunch of designers in the area. Some of them I know personally. Some of them I just know by name. I'll always give a list of designers and tell the client, here are some people you can contact. And I'll tell them that I don't know which one would be better for you. It's up to you to decide that. But I'm not able to do the job right now. So here are some people locally that you can get a hold of. And that little courtesy, I'm hoping that maybe someday when I'm not so busy and I can handle their work, they'll appreciate that I was offering them this advice and they'll come back to me. Now, if you're talking about passing off work to another designer that you've actually been hired to do, that's a completely different scenario. First off, you got to remember that clients have hired you as the designer because they wanted you. It's not like they've hired an agency and it could be any one of the designers that works for the agency that works on the project, so it could be passed around. In most cases, especially if you're a home-based designer, they've hired you and they want you to work on the job. So I would not recommend passing off any part of the design to somebody else unless the client knew that from the get-go. Now, in some cases, like what I would do, if I talk to a client about a project and we're going over the specs and say it calls for an illustration, well, I'm not an illustrator. So I'll tell the client up front that I will have to hire somebody else to do the illustration. And I do have some contacts. I know some people that are good illustrators. I'll have to get somebody else to do that. Or maybe a photographer. Yes, I can take pictures. I have a really good camera, but photography is not my specialty. So in those cases, I will tell the client that I would prefer hire a photographer to do it, but I let them know up front. It's in my contract that this stuff is going to happen. So in those cases, it's okay to pass off those creative parts of the project. Now, the other thing that I have done, and this is whenever you're given a project and there's certain parts of that project that are just tedious and it's not really designing. It's not the creative part of it, but it's stuff that has to get done. In those cases, yes, it is okay to hire somebody else to handle it for you as part of a collaboration on the project. Like maybe if you're designing websites and there's certain part of the back end of the website or coding that you can possibly do, or maybe you can't do and you need to hire a developer, well, that's completely acceptable. But in other cases, maybe it's something like, I know a project that I did a few years ago where it was a catalog for a local retail company and they wanted to do this print catalog. and they had about 200 products in it, and they gave me the photos digitally, but they wanted every single photo to have the background removed, so it was just the product showing on a white page. Well, I could have easily done that in Photoshop, but really it was around 200 photos, and I really didn't want to take the time to do that. So in that case, what I did is I contacted a graphic design college, and I talked to one of the professors there, and I asked if he had any students that would be willing to tackle this job. And I told them what the deadline was, and I was willing to pay them. And the professor actually came back to me with 4 different students. He says any one of these would be good. So what I actually did is I contacted all 4 of them, and I gave them roughly about 50 photos each, and I told them what I needed, and they took care of it. And while they were doing that, I was able to work on the rest of the catalog, get everything ready, and whenever they gave me back the photos, I just plopped the photos in and everything was perfect. I paid them for their time, and I made sure that when the project was done, I sent them each a copy of the catalog. And this is great for the students because they get to put something like this on their resume. It gives them practice. They've actually dealt with a real world experience. They had a real deadline, not just a deadline set by their teacher for a project. This was a real client deadline they had, and they all came through. So in cases like that, yes, it's okay to pass work along, but I'm not actually passing up on the project. I'm just assigning different parts of the project to other people, and I'm kind of acting like art director on it. But I do tackle the main design stuff myself because that's what they're hiring me for. Now you got to remember, you're running a graphic design business, not an agency, as I said. So it's not like you have a team of designers on staff to share the workload like an agency does. It's okay to have contractors for hire that can do as I said, illustrations, photography, maybe copywriting, some coding. But when it comes to the actual designing of the project, that should be fully on you. Now, as far as where I've found contractors before, as I said, college is great. I've used college students quite a bit over the years for various tasks, and they're always very keen to get some real life experience, as I said. But if you're going to go this route, make sure you do pay them a decent price. And I would discuss this with the professor, what the professor thinks, because different schools might have different ideas. And the professor is going to be talking to the students. So talk to the professor and say, what do you think is a fair price for this? Because the last thing you want to do is be taking advantage of the students. Because you have to remember, the students will go after a while, they'll graduate and they'll move on. But the professors usually stick around. And if you contact the school in the future, and if you took advantage of the students before and didn't compensate them properly, that professor is not going to want to pass on your work anymore. So keep a good relationship going. And whatever time, of course, that they spend on the project, you can then incorporate that into the price for the project that you're charging. In the case of the catalog, I agreed to pay each student a fixed price. And then I, in turn, charged my client a much higher price for doing that job and made money on it. Now, if you don't want to go the student route, I have hired a few people in the past through Elance, which has now changed its name to Upwork at upwork.com. I've hired developers for certain web projects on that, and I have hired illustrators through them before. Just make sure you do your research when you're hiring someone from that site. And to be honest, the rest of them, if I was looking for something specific, I just did a Google search for that specific topic, and then I would contact a few of them to see what they were all about, and if there was somebody I wanted to work with on this project. As for local designers, as I mentioned earlier, I have passed on work whenever I wasn't able to do something, but I've never actually contacted a local designer to say, would you do this work? I've only told clients that if I can't do it, here are some designers you can contact. And whether they decide to contact them or not, I don't know. Or I've never actually passed on work to another designer myself. I prefer, I don't know, it's almost like even though I don't view them as competition, because there's plenty of work to go around, I want to remain on good terms with them. So I don't want to start working with them in that way. Or at least I haven't found somebody that I really want to work with. Maybe the day will come where somebody local and will really hit it off design-wise and maybe collaborate on a project. I don't know. However, I have reached out to other designers to ask them for recommendations for contractors. Like a couple of years ago, I was working on a project and I needed a specific type of illustration, a specific style. And I could find stuff online of people with that, but I reached out to another local designer that I knew just to find out if he knew anybody that did that sort of style of illustration. And he gave me a name of somebody that worked out great. So sometimes it's okay to reach out to other designers for that sort of thing, but I've never actually passed work on to any of them. So anyways, I don't know if that answers your question, Terry, but that's my take on passing on work. Anyways, best of luck to you. And if anybody else has any questions they'd like me to cover on a future episode of the podcast, feel free to send them in, resourcefuldesigner.com/feedback. Now, if you want to keep up with what I'm doing, you can follow me on Twitter at ResourcefulD or my Facebook page at facebook.com/resourcefuldesigner. Now, I know I mentioned it a few times in the episode, but once again, my resource this week is Backblaze, the easiest way to securely back up your computer's information. You set it up and never have to worry about it again, but you get peace of mind to know that your files are secure. So check it out by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/backblaze. So until next week, I'm Mark DeCote, wishing you all the best in your graphic design business, and as always, reminding you to stay creative.
Thanks for listening to the Resourceful Designer podcast at resourcefuldesigner.com.